So here we are at the end of this course. Have we been talking about something that's real or something that we just imagined? When we began, way back in September, we defined Carpathian Rus as a historic territory, that it wasn't an existing state with concrete boundaries, but rather a historic territory in the heart of Central Europe. Majority population, at least at the outset of the 20th century, comprising an East Slavic people known by various variants of the name Rusyn. For reasons that we also discussed in the very first lecture, we decided to refer to the people in question as Carpatho-Rusyns. So that was what the people were. And then the territory. What about the territory of Carpathian Rus, physical territory? And what about Carpathian Rus today and in the immediate future? Is Carpathian Rus a reality? Or is it only an idea? That is something that contemporary theorists of nationalism like to refer as an imagined community. Have we been imagining all semester? Well, I guess it would be fair to say that Carpathian Rus is both. The status of the Carpatho-Rusyn people within the real and the imagined Carpathian Rus differs quite markedly, however. At first glance, it may seem that there is nothing much left to Carpathian Rus today. The historic territory that stretched from the Poprad River in the west, that's why you needed to know the Poprad River, to the upper reaches of the Tisa River in the east, straddling four countries, Poland, Slovakia, Ukraine, and Romania. The population living in this territory we have seen has changed radically. Most of the inhabitants whose parents and grandparents may have identified as Carpatho-Rusyns at the beginning of the 20th century now identify with another nationality, whether Slovak or Polish or Ukrainian. Since World War II, we saw how there has been an influx of other peoples into the various parts of historic Carpathian Rus, in particular Ukrainians and Russians into Subcarpathian Rus or Transcarpathia, Poles into the Lemko region. So as a result, at the outset of the 21st century, there were a total of 56,000 persons who identified themselves as Carpatho-Rusyns by nationality or language. 56,000. That number is only a tiny fraction of the nearly 2 million people who inhabited Carpathian Rus today. So we have roughly 2 million people, and we only have 56,000 who actively identify. Now, granted, those numbers, the 56,000 in particular, reflect official census data, and we all know that even in the best of circumstances, certainly that's not the case in some parts of present-day Carpathian Rus, but even in the best of circumstances, statistics, and particularly statistics on questions of identity, are highly suspect and unreliable. This leads us then to the question of the other Carpathian Rus. The other Carpathian Rus, that is, Carpathian Rus as an idea. Now, in a very real sense, nationalities are themselves the result of an idea made real. Of an idea made real. In other words, nationalities are the result of concepts about identity formulated by individual intellectuals or by the state authorities, which are then promoted, accepted by a group of people as a legitimate mechanism for self-identity. Modern history has also taught us that the eventual acceptance by a people of a common national identity may be achieved through voluntary means or through involuntary means. Put another way, the entire history of Carpatho-Rusyns since the 19th century, which is what we have been covering in this course, has been the story of how states and intellectual leaders have manipulated the nationality and the closely related language question to suit their own political needs or personal tastes. Now, these questions have been particularly prominent in Carpathian Rus during periods that scholars have characterized as national awakenings. The first of these national awakenings took place in Carpathian Rus during the Austro-Hungarian Empire between 1848 and 1868. The second national awakening during the interwar years of the 20th century, in particular in Czechoslovakia, that is between 1919 and 1938. And we now know that there has clearly been a third national awakening since the revolutions of 1989. Now, what, if anything, makes this third national awakening since 1989 different from the first two? And if the first two came to an end, then the third hasn't yet come to an end yet. But what makes it different? Maybe it won't come to an end. So what is the difference? And does this third national awakening promise to make the idea of Carpathian Rus more of a reality? Hence, real or imagined, idea and reality. Or reality and idea. Now, one of the most striking aspects of this post-1989 national revival has been its all-Carpatho-Rusyn or interregional context. For the first time since the political divisions put in place on the dark lines of this map after World War I, for the first time since then, Carpatho-Rusyns from every country have been meeting periodically and to a large degree coordinating their cultural activity. Now, it's true that in the past, Carpatho-Rusyns from one region may have cooperated with those in another region. We have the great example of 1918, 1919, when Carpatho-Rusyn American immigrants in the United States played a very active role in homeland politics. When Lemko-Rusyns from the old Austrian Galicia tried to unite with their brethren south of the mountains in historic Hungary. Yes, this happened, but those and other efforts were limited, whether in geographic scope, to a particular region or two regions, or in time, usually lasting no more than a few months or a year or so. Now, recent Carpatho-Rusyn inter-regional cooperation initiated at the First World Congress of Rusyns in 1991, and then since then at meetings of the Congress's executive, the so-called World Council, held 3 or 4 times annually between the full Congress, and the Congress meets every 2 years. So this is a steady functioning body. Carpatho-Rusyns from various countries also collaborate on several concrete projects, such as language codification, publications, exhibits, theatrical performances, student exchanges. And all of these kinds of projects and periodic meetings afford writers, scholars, other cultural activists, give them the opportunity to interact personally, to exchange ideas, to realize that their own aspirations are similar to those of Carpatho-Rusyns in other countries. Before then, they didn't even know that they existed sometimes. The Lemko-Rusyns in Poland, even the intellectuals, had no idea that there were Rusyns in the Vojvodina in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia. All of this was made possible after the collapse of communist rule. In now interacting with others from other countries from whom they can learn and work in solidarity for the achievement of common and specific goals. In short, the present Carpatho-Rusyn national revival has broken out of the provincial-minded mode that had characterized it during the 2 previous revivals that we know about, whether in the second half of the 19th century or the interwar years of the 20th century. Modern technology has made this kind of interregional cooperation much easier. Text and other communications readily transmitted by telephone, by email, computer disk, various means available on social media. Privately owned automobiles made possible and has made possible much more frequent physical contact between activists from the various Carpatho-Rusyn inhabited regions. By the way, the farthest from Lemko-Rusyns in Poland to the Vojvodina in northern Serbia, separated by about 400 kilometers. Now, we of course know that this interregional communication has become possible because of the profound change in the international political climate. For over 4 decades following World War II, we've just been looking at that. The communist regimes that had ruled the region restricted the flow of traffic across heavily guarded borders. They were real borders. Actively discouraged contacts among Carpatho-Rusyns. But the revolutions of 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union 2 years later in 1991, opened and in some cases literally tore down borders, especially among those countries which sought and eventually achieved membership in the European Union. This striving toward European integration has also brought Carpatho-Rusyns as a group, to the attention of institutions, European institutions, such as the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Council of Europe. Numerous decrees issued by these bodies calling for, quote-unquote, unimpeded contacts between individuals of the same nationality but living in differing states. There's this famous Conference on Security and Cooperation agreement reached in Copenhagen in 1990. You can't limit contact between people of same nationality even if they live in different states. There's a decree in June 1990 proved to be of particular importance, obviously, to the Carpatho-Rusyn movement because they live in different states. In effect, and this is important, Carpatho-Rusyns became the concern of other European countries and non-governmental organizations, which argued that the right of an individual to decide one's own national identity and to self-expression in one's own native language derives from the general principles of human rights that are considered inalienable for all Europeans. The culmination of these developments came with the effective elimination of borders in 2004, when Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and then eventually Croatia became part of the European Union. In many ways, Carpatho-Rusyns now live in only two countries: the European Union, to which Serbia, by the way, is a candidate, and Ukraine. The degree to which Ukraine can be gradually integrated into Europe will only work in favor of Carpatho-Rusyns that are still separated by at least one border, that is between Slovakia, Hungary, and Ukraine. Enemies as friends. What do I mean by enemies as friends? One aspect in which the present Carpatho-Rusyn national revival is actually similar to previous revivals has to do what might be called internal enemies or antagonistic rivals. Internal enemies. Now, let's be clear here. Neither in the past nor in the present did or does every individual of Carpatho-Rusyn heritage believe that the ethno-linguistic group to which he or she belongs should function as a distinct nationality. And we've been talking about that, but that doesn't mean that everyone believes that or wants that. But for those who supported such a proposition that Carpatho-Rusyns are a distinct people, the internal enemy in the 19th century were the so-called Magyarons. That is, Carpatho-Rusyns themselves who wanted at all costs to give up their Slavic heritage and become part of the Hungarian state nationality. Later, during the interwar years of the 20th century, we saw how large numbers of Carpatho-Rusyns believed that they were, and therefore they actually became, if they believed it, then that's what they are, either Russians or Ukrainians. And by the way, as a corollary, these converts to either a Russian or a Ukrainian identity rejected the idea of a distinct Carpatho-Rusyn nationality. Today, it is only the pro-Ukrainians that remain the internal nemesis of Carpatho-Rusyns. And here we're actually in many ways not talking about quote-unquote real Ukrainians. We're talking about those Carpatho-Rusyns who believe they're Ukrainians. From the very outset of the present Carpatho-Rusyn national revival that began in 1989, local Ukrainian-oriented organizations and spokespersons rejected the idea of what they spoke about as Rusin separatism, which, by the way, is a terrible word in present-day Ukrainian political culture, for the obvious reasons that we know. There's a little bit of a war going on. Or the other thing was called political Rusinism. So Rusin separatism, political Rusinism. One sense negative from the standpoint of Carpatho-Rusyns, because that's what they're being branded as. But there was a positive side to this kind of criticism or branding. What was the positive side? Well, it's based on the principle that new movements of any kind are able to focus better on specific goals when they are criticized from without. I mean, this was famous Lenin, in the Bolshevik Revolution. If we don't have an enemy to one of our policies, we have to create one. This will help us. In other words, the Carpatho-Rusyn movement was actually helped by the pro-Ukrainians. Why? Well, there is often no better way to convince an individual to define his or her frequently vague or passive sense of nationality, and therefore one's own existence, than if that identity is denied by someone else. And so the phrase, often repeated by pro-Ukrainian polemicists, quote, "There was not, is not, and cannot be a Rusin language and people," actually helped to produce the opposite result. Carpatho-Rusyns who decisively opted to identify themselves as a distinct nationality. It's also significant to note that the gender and the socioeconomic composition of participants in the post-1989 current third Carpatho-Rusyn revival is much different from that which existed before. In those earlier revivals, mid-19th century, interwar years of the 20th century, the leadership role and the articulate spokespersons were almost exclusively male. Since 1989, however, women have been conspicuously present at Rusin World Congresses and at other international gatherings, on the editorial staff of the media and in schools, and nor are they present simply as tokens or in subordinate positions. Rather, in every country where Carpatho-Rusyns live, actually, interestingly, one exception is Ukraine, in all the others, women function as directors of the leading Carpatho-Rusyn educational and cultural institutions. And this visible presence of women in the Carpatho-Rusyn movement has occurred not because of any conscious effort at achieving gender balance. North American political correctness is not a social imperative in Europe. So we're not out for gender balance, but rather it's a result of respect for individual talent and commitment to the national movement. In short, women are more talented, and they got more guts than males, certainly in a political environment. There's another way that one could say that, but I'm not saying it here. they have something which males have, but they carry it out. It is also, now that you can laugh at, that's a smile I got from him, not the one with the machine, because he's elsewhere. It's also perhaps not an exaggeration to describe this post-1989 Carpatho-Rusyn revival, at least in its beginnings, as a movement of youth, resembling in many ways a revolt of sons against fathers. By the way, it's ironic that the founder of the Society of Carpatho-Rusyns in Ukraine, a man named Mikhailo Tomchan, the founder of the Rusin Initiative Group in Czechoslovakia just after the Velvet Revolution of 1989, a man named Alexander Zozulyak, both of them were sons of leading post-World War II Ukrainian writers in those respective countries, whether Ukraine or Slovakia. Both of them, both of these sons, were raised and educated as Ukrainians and believed themselves to be that until the revolution of 1989, which served as a catalyst for the discovery of what they came to consider their true Carpatho-Rusyn heritage. Analogously, the founding chairpersons of the first post-1989 Carpatho-Rusyn organizations, whether in Poland, Ukraine, Slovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, at the time, 1989, all were between 32 and 45. The oldest was 45. And in contrast to the leaders of previous Carpatho-Rusyn national revivals, who are often accused by their rivals as nationally retarded, not yet educated, and therefore not conscious of their true Ukrainian or their true Russian identity because they weren't smart enough. They just didn't understand this. They were, right, uneducated. Well, in actual fact, this post-1989 Carpatho-Rusyn national revival is made up mostly of leaders and spokespersons with a much different intellectual formation. Many of them were educated in the Ukrainian language, and they themselves had identified as Ukrainian before, at some point, consciously rejecting that identity and returning to something they felt was closer to their true selves as embodied in a Carpatho-Rusyn identity. I mentioned education, perhaps the most important of the factors that characterize this new third Carpatho-Rusyn movement. Until the mid-20th century, nearly 90% of Carpatho-Rusyns were rural dwellers, engaged in small-scale agriculture and related pursuits. Illiteracy had ranged from 30 to 50% in various regions as late as the 1930s, with the remainder of the population having only a few years of attendance at elementary school. The policies of the interwar Czechoslovak regime, in particular, helped raise educational levels. But actually, it was the post-World War II communist regimes that truly brought about an educational revolution. We always talk negative about communism. Well, they did do some positive things. Along with the spread of education came industrialization that encouraged thousands of rural Carpatho-Rusyns to work in factories and nearby towns and cities, most especially in Slovakia and to a lesser degree in Ukraine's Transcarpathia. The result? Most post-1989 Carpatho-Rusyn national activists have university degrees. They have spent most of their lives in urban areas, not in villages. They are fully comfortable functioning in modern industrialized societies. Of even greater contrast with the past is the fact that the present intellectual leadership now has as much of a nationality constituency living in towns as in villages. And regardless of where that constituency lived, nearly all its members have at least a senior high school level of education and are therefore more easily able to understand the value of preserving the Carpatho-Rusyn heritage. The very fact that a high proportion of the Carpatho-Rusyn population lives in towns has another advantage. This is related to the fact that the desire for cultural preservation often reflects a kind of nostalgic longing on the part of urban dwellers to recapture a rural-based, allegedly pristine youth surrounded by loving grandparents. Now, while in reality such a phenomenon is largely gone, it does remain an image that is perhaps stronger than ever in the mind. You know, the role of grandmothers in nationalism always has been super important. I remember what my grandmother said. My grandmother told me this. Usually more grandmother than grandfather, but that too. And therefore, if grandmother or grandfather said it, unlike your parents, then it must be true. You won't believe your parents, but for some reason, you'll believe your grandparents. Think about that. Of course, all of that doesn't mean that present-day creative Carpatho-Rusyn intellectual leaders are then satisfied with folk dancing and maintaining other forms of quaint, but certainly now antiquated rural artifacts. In fact, the urban-based intelligentsia, with its higher level of education, has since 1989 been producing forms of Carpatho-Rusyn culture that include experimental theater, political satire, literature about the human condition in contemporary urban societies, abstract art. Again, perhaps it's an irony of history that the Carpatho-Rusyn roots of the American artist and world-renowned 20th century, himself a cultural icon, Andy Warhol, were discovered by activists in the Carpatho-Rusyn National Revival, who managed in 1991 to create in the small town of Medzilaborce, Slovakia, a large-scale Warhol Family Museum of Modern Art, complete with 2 kiosk-sized replicas of the artist's Campbell tomato soup cans that stand at the museum's entrance, which is in stark contrast to the green surrounding Carpathian countryside. But what does all this mean for the immediate and long-term future? Does the inter-regional aspect of this recent third national revival, combined with the possibilities offered by modern communication facilities, a favorable international environment in an increasingly regionally conscious Europe, the existence of a gender-balanced and well-educated leadership and constituency, does all of this guarantee the future survival of a distinct Carpatho-Rusyn nationality in the Carpatho-Rusyn homeland? Predictions, of course, by their very nature, are problematic. But one thing is certain. Never before have Carpatho-Rusyns operated in a political and a socioeconomic environment that has allowed, and in the case of all states but one, encouraged the development of their distinct culture and language. And so in many ways, the future is in the hands of Carpatho-Rusyns and their leaders themselves. Perhaps the idea will once again become Carpathian Rus, the reality. Thank you.